Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Sandra, Catherine, Sebastian, and a special welcome back to Emma. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting us and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's continue with a lovely work of science and history, The Book of the Ocean by Ernest Ingersoll, author of Knockin' Round the Rockies, The Oyster Industries of the United States, Friends Worth Knowing, Wild Neighbors, The Crest of the Continent, etc. First published in 1898 by the Century Company, New York. Let's pick up right where we left off, in the middle of Chapter 3, The Building and Rigging of Ships. Let's begin. As for the shape of sails, all rigs seem reducible to two types, the lateen and the square. The former is characteristic of the eastern half of the world, the latter of the western half, including primitive America, where, so far as I know, only plain rectangular sails were ever made by the Indians. There must be some good reason for a broad division like this, and it is found in the different conditions which eastern and western seamen had to meet. The lateen seems to have originated in the Indian Ocean, is seen wherever Arabs are, and has been taken eastward by the Malays as far into the South Sea Islands as their influence extended. It is a huge triangular canvas extended at a steep angle by a long flexible yard balanced across the mast to which it is loosely hung and controlled by a sheet attached to the free corner. It is thus very lofty and therefore suitable to a region of steady and usually light winds. This is the characteristic rig of the Arab dhow, a model that has come down from remote antiquity and is capable of excellent service on the northern and eastern coasts of Africa, where it prevails. It was probably in a small vessel of this kind that the Apostle Paul suffered shipwreck, and an outgrowth and perfection of it is the dahabeah of the Nile, now become famous as a tourist pleasure boat, whose immense lofty sail is precisely adapted to catch every faint breath that comes across the river from the deserts. Such sails are spread like the great pointed wings of an albatross over the narrow decks of the Malayan flying prowess and other swift South Sea craft, and urge upon their fleet errands the xebecs, syaks, feluccas, and other light craft of the Levant and Barbary coasts, identified with former piracy and modern smuggling, as well as with fishing and freighting. Some of these boats have 2 or 3 masts, the Xebec and Felucca being notable because of the curious forward rake of the foremast. And in that extremely picturesque Portuguese fishing boat called the Muleta, there are, in addition to the big lateen sail, a huge free second sail ballooning out to leeward from the tip of the yard, and a host of little flying jibs forward, which somebody has well likened to a flock of birds hovering about the prow. Good examples of lateen-rigged boats may be seen in Louisiana, built and manned by the Greek, Maltese, and Sicilian fishermen. The difficulty of handling in rough or squally weather this long yard and expansive canvas makes it unsuitable for such weather as prevails in the western Mediterranean or on the Atlantic. And to meet these stormy and frequently changing conditions and obtain a rig with which they could beat to windward, the earliest rough-water seamen devised square sails. What the rig of the ancient far-voyaging Phoenician ships was, we have no means of knowing, but the indications are that they carried lug sails, which appear to be the simplest and earliest of the square forms. That is, sails suspended from short cross-yards, and controlled by ropes or sheets attached to their lower corners. Such at least were the sails of the Roman and Greek merchant and war vessels of the classical era, and they persist today in the local fishing smacks of the stormy Adriatic. The true home of the square-sailed craft, however, was Northern Europe, where the Norwegian, Dutch, and Norman coasters and fishermen of today probably represent fairly well the rigs of the bold Viking boats of 12 or 15 centuries ago. Of the slow development of shipbuilding during the Middle Ages, we have little information, but in the 14th century, we begin to hear of a revival in the art, as indeed was needful when the long voyages were to be undertaken which the discovery of the mariner's compass had then rendered possible. In this revival, the Venetians and Genoese took the lead, but the English were not far behind. There was a large variety of vessels in that day, rude though they were, and called by names we should hardly recognize. Though the hulls of these vessels were large and tight, their shape was poorly adapted for speed or for safety in bad weather. Their decks were built up into immensely high structures at the stern and bows, after the old galley model, and to form forts for soldiers. Our word forecastle reminds us of this old usage. Their masts were single sticks, not divided into topmasts, and hence necessarily were thick and heavy, and they bore upon their summits large topcastles, where marines stood in battle to shoot down upon the enemy's decks. This weight above, with the height of surface exposed to the wind and the clumsy rigging, made it impossible for them to sail safely except with a fair and gentle wind. They never attempted it otherwise. And they were required to carry an enormous quantity of ballast. There was so little room for anything except armament, sleeping berths, and a cooking room in the warships, that every war fleet had to take with it small vessels carrying provisions, and the case was little better in respect to merchant vessels. The ships in which Vasco da Gama, Columbus, the Cabots, and other explorers did their marvelous work were no better than this. Strangely inefficient they seem to us, and we wonder that some of the simplest contrivances in rigging were not adopted centuries before they came into use, until we remember that it was not for long, speedy voyages that vessels were intended previous to the 16th century, with certain exceptions in northern seas, but simply as a means of carrying slowly from one coast port to another a great number of men or huge cargoes. However, as the known world widened and trade grew, inventions by private ship owners continually improved the rigging, though it would be hard to find a class of men slower to change old ways for new than the seamen. Columbus's caravel had 4 short masts, the forward one having a square lug sail, and the 3 after masts lateens. It was very gradually indeed that lateens were given up, and most curious combinations of sails were to be seen in this transition period of the 15th and 16th centuries. The old-fashioned Mediterranean barca, for example, had as foremast the forward-raking trinchetto of the felucca, with a huge lateen, while the mainmast bore 3 square sails and the mizzen 2 lugs. And in addition to this, 2 banks of oars were provided. In fact, it was not until 1800 that English frigates substituted a spanker for the lateen-rigged mizzen. Another curiosity of rigging possessed by these solidly built, beautifully carved vessels, no such exterior decoration has been seen since as adorned the ships of the 16th and 17th centuries, was the quaint little spritsail topmast. By this time, the single heavy pole mast had been superseded by the 3 built-up masts and topmasts braced by stays, made accessible by rope ladders called shrouds, and carrying several tiers of topsails instead of only one. A bowsprit had been added also, and this became almost a 4th mast, so loaded were it and its stays with various small sails. Its outer end bore this miniature spritsail mast, with topmast, shrouds, and tiny sails all complete, surmounted by a pole head or jackstaff, upon which was hoisted the flag since known as the Jack, and always now carried at the prow of any national boat or ship, even such as the shapeless monitors. But gradually, out of the experience of long voyages, the competition of merchants, and as an effect of improved gunnery and consequent changes in naval tactics, the lofty deck structures, great tops, needless outworks, and odd sails like this spritsail were got rid of, and vessels were trimmed down and equalized until they became, as now, ship-shape in Bristol fashion. The rigging of modern sailing vessels is divided into standing and running. The former includes the masts, their stays, now generally made of wire, and such other rope work as is not adjustable. The sails also may be assigned to 2 classes. First, those attached to a mast, with or without boom and gaff, or to a stay, which are called fore and aft sails, because they may be ranged lengthwise of the ship. And second, those suspended by their upper and lower edges to or between spars or yards, swung across the mast, and known as square sails, the lowermost of which are really lugs. All the variations of shape seen in America, except the rare and local lateens, can be counted in one or the other of these classes. The styles of rig visible in American waters are not many and are easily learned. Let us begin with the simplest, that having one mast. The catboat, i.e., a cat-rigged boat, is one having a simple pole mast stepped very near the bow and a fore and aft sail laced to a gaff and boom and managed by a sheet. This is the rig of the ordinary American sailboat, which is noted for its ability in pointing up into the wind. In England, it is known as a uniboat. Sometimes the peak of the sail is sustained by a loose little spar called a sprit instead of a gaff. In the chapter on yachting will be found further illustrations of these small rigs. A sloop has one mast with topmast, set well back from the stern, and a bowsprit. The sloop rig consists of a fore and aft mainsail, spread by means of a boom and gaff, a gaff topsail, a forestaysail, or one or more jibs. A cutter is now substantially the same thing, though formerly somewhat distinguished. Both are derived probably from the northern lugger, and old-time pictures show queer intermediate forms, often having a square topsail instead of a gaff. Thus the earlier of the Hudson River sloops, which were not only the freight carriers but the packet boats between New York and Albany, from the time the Dutch introduced them until steamboats took their place, had the top of the mainsail supported lug fashion by a short yard, and carried above that a square topsail. But this rig was steadily modified toward the modern type to make it faster and safer in the sudden squalls that beset this hill-girt river. Of two-masted rigs, the oldest is the brig, which has square sails on both masts, just like the main and mizzen masts of a full-rigged ship. Then there is the brigantine, a slight modification of the brig, and the hermaphrodite brig or brig schooner, with fore and aft sails on the aftermast. This kind of vessel has been greatly modified, one of its most extraordinary forms being the ketch, is less common now than formerly, and took its name, which is derived from the same source as brigand, from the fact that it was the most common rig of the pirates of the 16th and 17th centuries. Its place was largely taken for small vessels by a purely American invention, and one of the greatest of Yankee notions, the schooner. The schooner was originally small and had two masts, but now is often built of great size, with as many as 5 or 6 masts, each of which has a fore and aft rig, that is, a sloop's mainsail and gaff topsail on every mast, with forestaysail and several jibs in front and staysails between. Sometimes a square sail is placed on the foretopmast, which makes the vessel a topsail schooner. The first one was built by a Gloucester sea captain about 1817, and proved so satisfactory that all the fishing fleet were soon rigged in that way, whence the idea has spread to all parts of the world. Until recently, however, vessels large enough to have 3 masts were always square-rigged, as barks, barkentines, or ships. For although we have come to speak of any big vessel as a ship, yet in proper nautical language, a ship is a vessel rigged in a particular way, and it is nothing else. In fact, in olden times, they were sometimes very small, too small to be economical, as we now know. The Naval Chronicle for 1807 contained an account of a full-rigged ship of only 36 tons burden, which for 130 years previous to that date had been cruising about the English coast, and may be doing so yet, for aught I know. Masts have their proper names. The tallest is in the middle of the vessel and is called the mainmast. The next tallest stands in front of it and is the foremast. And the third is in the stern and is named mizzenmast because it carries the mizzen or sail. All the rigging, except that belonging to the bowsprit, is repeated for each mast, and each piece is named with reference to the mast or part of the mast or appropriate sail to which it belongs, as for example, main shrouds, fore shrouds, mizzen shrouds, mizzen royal, main topsail yard, foretopmast studding sail downhaul, and so on. In a proper full-rigged ship, all the sails upon the masts except the spanker are square, and are named from the sections of the mast opposite which they are hung. Counting from the deck to the truck or tip-top of the mast, they are as follows. On the mainmast, mainsail or main course, main topsail, main topgallant sail, main royal, and skysail. On the foremast, foresail or forecourse, foretopsail, foretopgallant, foreroyal, and skysail. On the mizzenmast, crossjack, and behind it the spanker, mizzen or driver, mizzen topsail, mizzen topgallant, mizzen royal, and skysail. The bowsprit sails are the forestaysail, the foretopmast staysail, the jib, flying jib, and outer jib, or jib staysail. Each of the stays running diagonally from mast to mast bears a triangular sail known by the name of the particular stay on which it hangs, as main topmast staysail, and so on, 9 in all. In addition to all this, a little sail is sometimes set above the skysail, and another under the bowsprit, while out beyond the ends of the yards are often extended light additional spars carrying studding sails. In favorable weather, when the captain wishes to crowd all on, as sometimes can be done for days and weeks together before the trades, almost 40 sails may be spread, and the ship moves grandly along under a swaying cloud of canvas that reaches far beyond her rails on either side, and towers more than 100 feet into the steady air. But the cost of building, maintaining, and handling these grand fabrics is so great that they are steadily diminishing in numbers, and perhaps are destined before long to disappear altogether from the seas, to which they have lent so much picturesqueness and romance. The supremacy of the schooner seems likely to prove complete. Unwilling to concede everything at once, many vessels are now rigged with square sails on the foremast and mainmast, and fore and aft sails on the mizzen, as in a bark, or square sails on the foremast only, and the others schooner rigged, as in a barkentine. But even these are disappearing in favor of the three-masted or four-masted schooner. This is due to the fact that the schooner rig will sail closer to the wind and gives as much force in proportion as the ship's style, while it is far less expensive to build and more quickly and easily managed, not requiring nearly as many men, and therefore being cheaper to run as well as to set up. It is for these reasons that I have called it one of the greatest of Yankee notions. Chapter 4: Early Voyages and Explorations. Part 1: Previous to the discovery of America. Wherever it may have been that man first appeared upon the earth, the period must certainly have been incalculably long ago, for he had time to spread to all parts of the habitable globe long before any sort of record begins. Little if any part of the world has yet been found where the evidences of man's residence in the long-forgotten past do not exist. So long ago that all tradition of it is forgotten, and only the imperishable stone implements they used remain as traces of their presence. Mankind had reached and settled the farthest northern and eastern coasts of Europe and Asia, and the southern extremities of Africa and India. These might have been reached by land, but similar traces exist in many islands, which, so far as we can see, could never have been connected with each other or with any continent by lands now submerged, as perhaps has been the case in some other islands since man originated. Such places, then, could have been reached and colonized only by means of boats, and that at an exceedingly remote time. Some hint of what these prehistoric navigators might have been able to do may be gathered from the performances that we know of in the South Sea, where almost every island and coral atoll that could support a colony has apparently been inhabited, since long before even tradition begins, although some of them, like the Hawaiian group, are separated from all others by hundreds of miles of open sea. It is exceedingly interesting and suggestive to read in a work like Professor Frederick Ratzel's History of Mankind of the dispersion of population over the islands of the South Pacific Ocean, where a mixed population of races possessed themselves of the whole of Oceanica long before white men had even heard of that part of the world. This astounding fact gains in significance when we remember that wide tracts of very deep ocean divide these islands, many of which are so small that they were found by exploring navigators only with difficulty. Cook and Beechey and other early voyagers note finding upon certain islands people who had come thither in their own boats over distances of 600 or 800 miles, and there are many instances of castaways surviving voyages of 1,000 or 1,500 miles even against the trade winds. But these involuntary voyages were no longer than many others undertaken for war or trade, or because of famine, or a mere love of wandering. Overpopulation of the limited spaces of most islands and groups led to the colonization of others, and it must often have been necessary to go far away to seek unoccupied or thinly peopled refuges. This could not have been done had men not been good shipwrights not only, but careful students of the heavens, by whose sun and moon and stars they steered, aiding themselves with charts made of sticks. The remotest groups, like the Sandwich Islands and Easter Island, were found and settled too long ago even for tradition to retain more than a fabulous story about it. These Vikings of the Pacific, says Raffle, continue to discover even small and remote islets. In the whole of the Pacific, there is not one island of any size of which it was left to Europeans to demonstrate the habitability. It has even been argued that the continent of America was peopled by Pacific Islanders, who made their way to it from Polynesia. But of this there is no direct evidence, and it seems unlikely, because the prevailing winds and currents flow from South America rather than toward it in this part of the Pacific. But leaving these dim old times when barbarous men voyaged far and wide overseas, and races mingled that were born on opposite sides of wide waters, let us note what traveling our civilized ancestors did. The evidence of ruined walls, graves, carvings, and stone tools show that the earliest of civilized races of which we now have any knowledge, the Hittites, were acquainted not only with the coasts of the Mediterranean Sea, but had boldly rounded the headlands of Spain, skirted the stormy Bay of Biscay, and settled colonies in England and France. Who were these Hittites? They were an Asiatic people, dwelling in the Taurus Mountains of the eastern part of Asia Minor, who increased into the most powerful nation of that part of the world about 2,000 years before Christ, and carried on wars with the Egyptians among others, until at last they were overcome by the rise of the Empire of Assyria north of them about 1,100 years before Christ. Doubtless they explored the African coast somewhat south of the Red Sea, and very likely knew the Persian Gulf and the route to India. My own opinion is that we are likely to give the people of antiquity too little credit, rather than too much, in the direction of a knowledge of geography. Meanwhile, there were rising along the Mediterranean from Palestine northward the most able commercial race of antiquity, who styled themselves Canaanites as in the Bible, but whom the Greeks called Phoenicians, the name by which we know them best. Their capitals were the cities Tyre and Sidon, the ruins of which are still to be seen on the Syrian coast, a little way south of Beirut, and the wealth and commercial power of which will give us some interesting paragraphs for a future chapter. Suffice it here to say that their rulers were foremost among the loosely organized nations between the Nile and the Euphrates, and that they maintained their power through a long period, not only by their wealth and enterprise as traders, but mainly through their skill and energy as navigators. As we shall see when we come to consider their commerce in Chapter 7, they excelled in the building of ships, in an understanding of how to steer long courses by the heavenly bodies, and in sea knowledge generally. It is well known that the Phoenicians traded in their ships down the west coast of Africa, to and beyond the Canary Islands, which they also visited, made repeated voyages to the French coast and the British Islands, and may very likely have gone around into the Baltic, for they knew of its amber, though this might have been obtained by the overland trade routes. It is believed that they ascertained that Africa was, in fact, a huge island, for it was to prove this supposition that Pharaoh Necho II, an enlightened Egyptian monarch who reigned in the 6th century before Christ, hired a crew of Phoenician seamen to man an expedition whose purpose it was to circumnavigate Africa. These men started down the Red Sea in 611 BC, and in 605 BC came sailing home through the Strait of Gibraltar, to the delight of their friends and confusion of a kingdom full of I told you so's. Just 20 centuries elapsed before anyone else repeated that feat, so far as I know, and no wonder it was forgotten. This same Necho II did even more for maritime commerce, for he attempted to complete the canal, begun long before his time, connecting the Mediterranean with the Red Sea, and seems to have made a passage along which barges and small boats might be towed, which remained open for many centuries, and in part followed the line now covered by the Suez Canal. Earlier than that, Darius, the Persian conqueror of Egypt, had dug a navigable canal from the Nile to the Red Sea, and this shows that there must have been large traffic in both seas at that time to justify such tasks. By this time, the power and prosperity of Tyre and Sidon had declined, and Carthage, originally a colonial city, had become the most important center of Phoenician influence, and from this port there sailed a century later, perhaps about 500 BC, an exploring expedition under a Carthaginian king named Hanno, intended to study and establish trade with the West African coast. It was a large and powerful fleet, said to number 60 galleys, and that women were taken as well as men shows that it was intended to form settlements at suitable points, as indeed was done. The account of it has been preserved in a short writing called the Periplus by an ancient but unknown Greek, and this inscription is regarded by most scholars as entirely authentic, since all its details conform to modern knowledge, even though it is impossible to identify surely the various points mentioned. It tells us that the terminus of Hanno's exploration was an island beyond a gulf called Noti Cornu, in which he found a company of hairy women whom the interpreters called gorillas. It was in memory of this that the man-like apes which a few years ago were discovered on the west coast of Africa received the same name, but they are not known anywhere north of the Cameroon Mountains, while the farthest point any critic is willing to believe reached by Hanno is the Bight of Benin, some distance north of the Cameroons. It is easy to believe that the inquiring Carthaginians might have heard of these apes, or perhaps of chimpanzees, now found as far north as the Gambia River, and reported actually seeing them in order to add glory to their name. At any rate, this expedition increased largely the ancient knowledge of the sea in that direction, and navigators now knew the shores of the Atlantic from the Gulf of Guinea to the North Sea. But there the knowledge of the world seems to have rested for more than a dozen centuries, principally, no doubt, because there seemed nothing beyond, either north or south, to invite the merchants who then, as ever since, have been the principal promoters of discovery. It is only within the past century that voyages of discovery have been undertaken purely for the sake of the increase of knowledge. Previous to that, the object was always either military conquest or the extension of trade. Attention was now turned to the eastern seas, overland routes to India and even to China having become well known both to conquering armies and to mercantile caravans. the coasts of Abyssinia, of Arabia, of the Persian Gulf, and of western India were settled by a semi-civilized people for 1,000, perhaps 2,000 years before the Christian era, but they were broken into many independent tribes, and their ships, if they had any, only crept from one harbor to another nearby, and neither knew nor cared what lay beyond the farther headlands. As time went on, however, and strong kingdoms arose in Egypt, Arabia, Syria, and Persia, consolidating these scattered tribes into nations, it became necessary to learn the sea routes between more distant ports. Thus it came about that while the pharaohs still flourished, Arabic commerce extended regularly along the coast of Abyssinia, and doubtless as far southward as Zanzibar, while the Malays had probably already reached and colonized Madagascar. There seems no reason to doubt that those remarkable ruins in stone, which the late Mr. Thomas Bent has studied at and near Zimbabwe in Mashonaland, East Africa, are the work of Arabian gold miners, made perhaps 1,000 or more years ago, and it is pretty certain that Arabic seamen even at that date regularly traded as far as the island of Madagascar. The Persian Gulf has been another nursery of a seafaring people since long before the record of history begins. Yet so slow were they to learn of anything outside their capes that it was accounted a wonderful thing when in the winter of 325 to 324 BC, Nearchus, the admiral of the fleet of Alexander the Great, voyaged from the mouth of the Indus to the head of the Persian Gulf. Soon afterward, however, under the house of the Ptolemies, rulers of Egypt, fleets sailed regularly between Red Sea ports and India and Ceylon. But now, for many long centuries, the boundaries of the known world were not to be much enlarged, although methods of navigation were improved and commerce continued within the limits of Roman and Arabic dominion, for we know of the discovery of no new coasts until we begin to hear of the doings of an independent and far northern people, scarcely known to the civilized world, and certainly not regarded as a part of it. On the bleak shores of the North Sea, where the fjords and creek mouths of Scandinavia gave shelter not only from foreign enemies but from each other, there had grown up a seafaring race of men of Gothic ancestry, who had settled on the coasts of what are now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They styled themselves Norsemen, or men of the north, and did not object to the title Vikings or fjordmen, but their enemies called them pirates, and with much reason, for they ravaged and ruled all the coasts both north and south of the Baltic, voyaging northward to the land of the midnight sun, colonizing northern France in the 10th century, and taking practical possession of all they pleased of the British Isles, Ireland and northern Scotland in particular. Here these Norsemen met equally fierce foes, or found congenial partners, as the case may be, in the Scottish and Irish seamen of that day, who were themselves bold freebooters and wide voyagers. And when, in the middle of the 9th century, the Northmen had discovered, as they supposed, the Faroe Islands and Iceland, a little exploration soon showed them that the Irish culdees, or priests of the Christian Church, planted in Ireland by St. Patrick, had been there before them, first in 725, according to the Irish chronicles of Diquilus, who seems worthy of credence, Indeed, it is believed by some antiquarians that these Irish sea wanderers had colonized Iceland at the same early age, had reached Newfoundland, and regularly resorted to its banks for fishing and whaling 500 years before Cabot, and were even acquainted with the coast of the North American continent, where traditions assert that their colonies were planted on what are now the shores of Virginia and the Carolinas, which they called New Ireland. These are entertaining old stories, and may have some truth in them, for it seems certain that the Irish reached Iceland at least in the 8th century. Icelandic history, however, begins with the visits of Norsemen in 850, followed by others, who, a few years later, took colonies there and set up an island population, which before a century had elapsed, numbered more than 50,000 people. They had a republican form of government and were quite independent of the King of Norway, Harold the Fair-Haired, great-great-grandfather of William the Conqueror, from whom the earlier colonists had fled because of his oppression. But they kept up acquaintance with the mother country, and merchants and adventurers were continually voyaging between Iceland and all the islands and coasts of that region, using staunch vessels sometimes 100 feet in length and eminently seaworthy. Yet their only guides were the stars, and such signs as seafaring men read in the water and weather about them. And that seems as good a place as any to end this evening's reading from the Book of the Ocean by Ernest Ingersoll. When next we return, we're going to go exploring with some Vikings, so that's something to look forward to. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the illustrations, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod, or drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.